Welcome to the Narrate podcast, where we aim to tell God's story with our lives. We'll be continuing to post the Sunday message each week, but we want to dive a little deeper and offer some content to supplement your life with God, and that's where our Beyond Sunday series comes in. Join Adam and Narrate staff as they provide thoughtful discussions, ideas, and interviews that go beyond the message you'll hear on Sunday.
Hi. Thanks. You've given us a lot of your Sunday. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Obviously, this is about creating space for you to ask your questions and learn more about Kris, learn more about Anglicanism, learn more about C4SO, learn more about Atlanta. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of open. ATL. Kind of. What's that?
ATL. Maybe.
So we didn't tell anybody that we were going to record this, but we are recording this. And so with that in mind, Hannah's going to run a mic around. Also, I'm going to try to repeat that question, but I thought we would just start having everybody introduce themselves. I'm just kidding. These guys have listened to me talk way too much about why I've opted for Anglican identity. Can we just start by you going what are the couple things that just are here's the why behind my what?
Yeah. So the why behind the what in terms of my journey?
Yeah, why you're in, because you weren't raised Anglican.
I was not. I was raised by wild animals, actually. My parents were card-carrying hippies. I was named after Kris Kristofferson. So we were Kris with a K. So for all of you over 45 in the room, let's go. R.I.P. Kris, he just died. So my parents were about as non-traditional as you could absolutely be. My mother became a believer when I was 2 in the charismatic evangelical world. So very extemporaneous, very free church. My dad became a believer much later when I was about 12 years old. So I was not raised in a traditional Christian space. And then when I was in a Christian space, it was definitely not a liturgical one. So I planted with a group of friends, the church that I pastor now 26 years ago. So 23 years ago, I was 26. And ultimately that journey led me into the Anglican Church. And I would say the biggest reasons for that would have been I desired for myself pastoral authority and accountability in my life. And I was in a movement, the Vineyard, which I still love, but it was a very collegial space, which was great. It was we had friends, we would eat barbecue together, we would do those things. But I found myself longing for leadership in my life, people who would ask me whether I was loving my family and serving the church with integrity and credibility. So there was this question of I need a father, I guess would have been the way that I would have put it. The other thing I think that was really compelling for me was that I was just worn out by trying to be so clever all the time. The creativity and the innovation, and it was it felt like I remember a few years into the life of our church, I thought I think I've actually told these people Jesus loves them all the ways I know how to do it. May not be appropriate to say this, but I've always thought, and since we're in Montana, maybe I can say it. I at times felt like Custer must have felt at his last stand, just they're coming and I don't know what else to do. And so the gift of, at the time, stepping into a tradition that was older than me, bigger than me, where the Bible could come to me in terms of the lectionary rather than me coming to the Bible and picking and choosing from it like I would food at a Denny's buffet restaurant. Those things were really liberating to me because it took pressure off. But it didn't also, though, at the same time, it didn't absolve me from showing up and praying and creating content for sermons. I just was having a framework given to me that was bigger than me. And I think that the last thing, for me at least, when it came to Anglicanism, was I was really moved by the tradition of prayer within the Anglican world. Our other book is called the Book of Common Prayer. It's a way to put structure to prayer and to corporate prayer, individual prayer. And I also love the fact that the Anglican Church really brought church into a language that people understood. And I could be nerdy about that. I won't, because you're here to probably drink beer and listen to me for a few minutes and then find out who's winning the football games. But for me, at least, there was a sense of the book, the Bible, and prayer, in addition to something older than me, and then authority in my life. Those were the things that really drew me into the tradition.
Super helpful. All right, so who? I guess, do you want us to raise hands, Hannah, or do you want them to whistle? What do you want them to do? Just raise your hand.
And while y'all are thinking, I'll say this. It has been a real joy to get to know this guy over the last couple of years. And I've said it to him, I've said it to the staff, and even to the council members who came and the people I've been able to connect with over the last couple of days. Like, my heart in building a relationship with this guy is just to be a support and an encouragement to him on a journey that means something to him. That means I don't have like an agenda for this church. I mean, you guys this is an amazing place. I mean, being with you today, but I would say more than just being with you today, like being with you over the last few days has been such an example to me of a vibrant community of faith in a town like this. This is a beautiful place. And so I have no agenda for Narrate other than to walk alongside this guy and just to be able to give you an example of like other people that maybe he's been talking to that are actually real people that can come in and just show you like, okay, we're a part of a community together. And what I see at this church just is a beautiful thing. Y'all are doing really, really meaningful work for God in this city. So I'm honored to just be a part of the community this weekend.
What made you choose or like Anglicanism over Eastern or Roman?
Oh, that's a great question.
So Leslie wants me to repeat them all. So what made you choose Anglicanism over Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism? Is that the question? Wow.
That's a really good question. Did you plant that? What was that?
No, but that's...
So So when I read a guy named Alexander Schmemann and fell in love with the theology of the Orthodox Church, and then put my kids, when I was a vineyard pastor, into a Greek Orthodox school. And so we were the only non-Orthodox people in the school. And while we loved it, when I thought about the Eastern Orthodox Church, I think that there were not enough accessible bridges for me to get from the beauty of what was written by people like Schmemann into actual practical applied missiology. It was just so culturally located in some ways that it felt like too far afield. I think orthodoxy on paper is about as beautiful thinking as it gets when it comes to the Lord. So that put me essentially on, and I don't want to overinterpret this, but I've joked in the past that when I began to embrace the beauty of the historic church, it put me on the road to Rome, but I never got past England. And some of that was because I'm married and I have 3 kids, and that's a big part of it. But it was actually more than that for me, because our desire to become Anglican really wasn't a desire to become Anglican. We were just trying. So I planted Trinity with a group of friends when I was 26 years old, and y'all, we were probably one of the first churches of our kind that was in the city trying to reach people for Jesus. I care way more about Jesus and the kingdom than I do denominationalism. I'm actually not all that interested in denominations. I think they matter. But for us, our Anglican identity came because every time we ran into a limitation, I was looking somewhere for an answer. And it turned out I found like 8 straight answers that were Anglican answers. So for instance, like we saw all these kids start to come to know the Lord, like hipster kids from Atlanta, you know. And I was like, we got to catechize these kids. And so I found in the beauty of the Anglican tradition ways to get them more immersed in their faith. We had all these kids for whom Easter was just this like day you were supposed to get super pumped up, and then it was over. And I was like, the Anglican tradition, just like the Catholic tradition, tells us that there's a preparation season of Lent, and then Easter's not one day, it's 50 days. Like we get to celebrate for 50 days. And then I started reading people like N.T. Wright and J.I. Packer and C.S. Lewis. My son is named Finn Lewis after C.S. Lewis, who's I think one of the greatest laymen in the Anglican Church. And at some point I started to wonder if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, like maybe I'm a duck. And so our journey into Anglicanism wasn't so much like pros and cons. It was more being moved by the beauty of the church. I'm convinced that when God looks at Helena, he sees the cathedral, he sees Narrate, he sees the church in this city. He doesn't see all the little different churches. And I think when we were with him in his kingdom, that's the way it's going to be again. But where you land does matter. And for me, the Anglican tradition was about kind of finding ways to uncover ways to engage in mission in my local community in Atlanta. I hope that answers the question.
I, like you, come from a very non-liturgical background and happened to, at an estate sale by book of prayer, how do you use that in your congregation?
Oh, that's a great question.
So the question is, how do you use the BCP in your congregation?
Yeah, so we use the Book of Common Prayer in a number of ways. We use it to help frame the rhythms of the church year. So on the macro, seasons like Lent and Easter, what's called ordinary time, which in our church we refer to ordinary time, which is about 6 months of the year, as the green growing season. So it's green in the liturgical colors, but it's like super practical. So our kids ministry, they love the green growing season because it's just this time where you learn to put feet to your faith. And then you think about Advent and the 12 days of Christmas, Epiphany. So the Book of Common Prayer frames the rhythms for us. Another thing the Book of Common Prayer does is something I already alluded to. It puts the framework of a Bible teaching plan in front of us. And we don't treat that legalistically. Like there are times where what we call the Sunday lectionary, which just gives a plan. I mean, our friends in the Catholic Church and our friends in the Orthodox Church and other denominations, we all largely share a plan for our Bible teaching and reading. There are times where we will jump off of that to preach sermons about our values or felt needs. So it's not legalism. What I found that it is, though, is it provides a kind of trellis and a framework where things are able to grow. Another way that we use the Book of Common Prayer is through what's called the daily lectionary, which is basically a daily Bible reading devotional plan. So on the back of our flyer at Trinity and in our weekly email, we give people the readings from the Book of Common Prayer daily devotional plan. And the funny thing about my church, because we don't talk about it being Anglican, I do not wake up every morning, take my Anglican temperature. We just use the treasures of the Anglican Church. So our church, probably hundreds and hundreds of people read the daily lectionary, and they don't even know what that's called. They just know it's a big plan. And so those are some of the big ways. Other ways would be like we receive communion every Sunday at our church, and the way the Book of Common Prayer orders that part of our church life, it really shapes the way that we engage communion. As a pastor, when I marry people and bury people, the Book of Common Prayer helps me know how to show up into those spaces. I'll never forget officiating my last wedding where I let people just write their own vows. And I remember standing in front of them and going, I am so glad you guys really love one another. I am so glad that you think he's so hot. But like, your vows are promised to be faithful. They're not just telling you and the other person how much you love one another. And the Book of Common Prayer basically pulls our covenants and our rites of passage out of a super subjective space and says what's timeless. So the BCP frames a lot of what we do. Now, I will say this, if you were to come to Trinity, I would be wearing clothes like this when I preach, so we don't look like fancy Anglicans. We read a lot of the Bible from the lessons of the lectionary, but we don't make a big, so it's kind of sneaky liturgy, but the BCP frames a lot of our life together, both privately and corporately. I hope that answers the question.
Don't you also, is it during Advent that you do BCP, like morning prayer services?
We do multiple times a year. So during Lent, during Advent, we'll gather at 7 o'clock in the morning and do a straight up liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer that it'd be like we're reading all the prayers and the language and the words. And a lot of our people really love that, especially during certain times of the year. Our liturgies around Ash Wednesday or Good Friday are very much shaped by the Book of Common Prayer liturgy, like word for word.
And to your point of straying from it legalistically, like even this morning, the Mark passage in the lectionary was much shorter than what we actually did.
It was, so yeah. It was 17 to 31. And I was like, Adam, I'd like to do 13 to 31 because I actually think these are good to have together. So there's still freedom.
Did you get Jesus' permission to do that?
Yes. I got Thomas Cramner's permission to do it.
So my question has to do with your views and practice of spiritual warfare and how the Book of Common Prayer supports that.
Okay.
Views and practice of spiritual warfare and how the BCP supports that.
Yeah, so I love that question because I think that only in a place like the West are we insulated enough through our own affluence and access to money, wealth, medical intervention that we could deceive ourselves into believing that we don't live in a deeply spiritual world where there are forces aligned on our behalf and forces aligned against us. And I say that not as an anti-intellectual. I actually really believe thinking deep and true thoughts about God is really important. I would say I think C.S. Lewis in his Screwtape Letters came very close to hitting the nail right on the head when he said something to the effect of, in this satirical work, that if the devil wanted to convince Christians that believing in the devil was so ridiculous, that would actually be a pretty cunning strategy. So if you only imagine the enemy as someone with like horns and a pitchfork and little red tights, and you think, well, that's ridiculous, so I can't believe in that, then you end up finding yourself plundered and resisted and opposed. That would actually be a pretty clever strategy of the enemy. That being said, I don't think that we should be afraid, paranoid, or go looking for demons under lampshades and blaming everything on the devil. So again, like the Kris Kristofferson crowd, everybody over 45 remembers the church lady from Saturday Night Live who blamed everything on Satan. We can go in that direction too. But that, we had a deep connection with the Anglican Church in Rwanda. And Archbishop Collini has preached in my church, and he led the Church of Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide. And what Collini said to me, and I think this is really important, is he said, politics gone wrong is not a good explanation for what happened in the summer of 1994, where 1.2 million people were killed within the space of 90 days. At the peak of the Rwandan genocide, the death rate was 6 times the death rate of Auschwitz and Dachau at its peak during the Second Great World War. And this was not done through mass chemical or whatever. This was like a very grassroots, horrible thing. And one of those bishops said it was as if the devil of hell were wandering the streets of Kigali. And I think that's actually a better, more plausible explanation. Going back to Schmemann, one of my favorite Eastern Orthodox theologians, he speaks very convincingly about the fact that historically Christians have always believed in the existence and the reality of not just things gone wrong, but personified evil. Now I will say that we as the children of God have access to the power of God, the life of God. We know who wins. But that doesn't mean that we're not living our lives experiencing forms of opposition. And I think that it's the job probably of every Christian to open up their eyes and ask the Holy Spirit for insight and for power so that we as the children of God are able to walk in the light and see that the Lord wins. So that's a kind of a general framework, but I actually think that that's a really important question because many of us probably haven't thought 2 things about the fact that there could be spiritual warfare going on around us. And I just want to say, if we're going to give a vote, as G.K. Chesterton said, to the cemetery, Christians throughout the ages have believed in these things. Our friends up at the cathedral, I can guarantee you, believe in these things. And we also ought to be aware, not afraid, but aware.
Did Adam and Eve have a belly button?
Oh my goodness, dude. That is an
Adam and
awesome
Eve have a
question.
belly button.
That is an awesome question. Parker, what do you think? I don't really know either. My gut would say, here's what my gut would say, and again, I'm not a scholar on the Genesis narrative, but I think that God probably put one in there just because, he wanted their kids to look at parents and be like, oh, look at that, we're kind of in the same vein, but they definitely wouldn't have needed one in the same way that the ones who came after would have needed one. It's a good question, Parker. Wow.
Nice work, Parker. Only a Billy would ask that question. Uh-oh, coming with the big guns now.
So I was curious, I haven't been able to quite figure out the answer to my own research, but does Anglicanism view ecumenical councils in the same way that the Orthodox and Catholics do? Mm-hmm. Is it the same level of authority?
So the question is around, does Anglicanism view the ecumenical councils in the same way as the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics?
So Anglicans would hold to the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Creed of Athanasius as being our kind of guiding, unifying creedal principles. I don't know probably enough of the minutia, and I've had a beer with you, so I know you probably have thought about this. This guy up here is a smart dude on these subjects. But we are deeply creedal in our faith. And Anglicans historically understood, believe that our tradition did not begin in the 1600s during the English Reformation, but goes back to Augustine and beyond to the church fathers. And so one of the gifts, I think, of being in the Anglican Church is we don't think something totally brand new happened in 1660 whatever, but that we go back and stand in continuity with our friends in the East and the West.
My question is, when you became Anglican, we were told that the area would not change, that we would to a degree, but we would still be a non-denominational church. Are we still non-denominational, or when we're out in the public and someone asks, tell me about Narrate?
Yeah.
Do we now say we're an Anglican church?
No, not at all. We're not. We are very much non-denominational. And I think the way Kris framed this, even on Friday night, was really helpful to me. Is part of this discerning journey is this just a personal journey for me? And I'm really okay if that's what it is, or is this bigger than me? And that's the more, I think that's the moment that we're in right now, that part of this is a part of just helping us kind of discern through that and walk through that. So I didn't repeat the question, but it had to do with whether or not we're still non-denominational. And does that answer that, Carol?
Yeah, it does. The bigger part of that, I guess, is with you being part of, she has a loud voice anyway, but the bigger part of that is with you becoming Anglican, is there a church above us that's going to say, you guys have to do this way now? That's more.
Yeah, let's frame it this way, because this was one of my questions, if it got dull. Yeah, so the question has to do is, I think the question is, what does it mean for Adam to be under a bishop, right? And what does that look like? Which was one of the questions I was going to ask if it got dull.
Yeah, so it's a really important question, because right now, with Adam being ordained in the Anglican Church, he is under authority, which is an authority that cares for his soul and would guard and protect his own theological trajectory, in the sense that he wouldn't just wake up and make up all the things that he would think. He's joining a tradition. One of the gifts of Anglicanism is the same as it is with all the major traditions of the church, is that Anglicanism is a received tradition. So he's putting himself in a position to receive teaching, to also be cared for and loved and connected. When a church comes in, then the church also would begin to receive and be cared for. And we're in a situation right now to where this guy's having his soul cared for, being equipped and resourced and loved on. Your church is still going to benefit from I was talking to Lexi the other night. I don't know where you are in the room, if you're still here, but gifts of, just from child protection stuff, our denomination and diocese will help churches, even that aren't in our tribe, work those things out. But you as a church are led by a board. You are functioning as an independent, non-denominational church. We're just caring for this guy and loving on him, but not meddling in the affairs of what's happening at Narrate. And I would say, though, having been in the Anglican tribe for 15 years, the Anglican tribe's never meddled in the affairs of my church, other than to resource, support, encourage, and hold us accountable on the areas where we really wanted. But no, you're in a different situation as a community. We're just loving on this guy and encouraging him.
Yeah, and and the staff as a whole, there's just been a lot of benefit I think it's easy to underestimate how hard it is for people on our staff to network professionally with people that resonate with them, that feed them, that challenge them. It's really hard to find professional community, and I know that's happening. And then frankly, getting out of state. I was just talking with Bo earlier of Montana has this thing, and we were talking about it yesterday. We're famous for being 10 years behind, right? And some of that's just, it's happened because of geography, but even just in some of the conversations we've had, we've been so proud from the very beginning of being innovative and on the leading edge of things. But there's some technical minutia where the council and I have really begun to talk of and we're kind of behind in some ways that leave us a little bit vulnerable if we don't handle this well. So my point being, whether or not we become C4SO, we're better because we're learning from this really innovative, awesome group of people and churches. Next question.
So this is probably a bit of a can of worms question for you, but last year the Anglican Church of England announced that they are supporting, that they do not support homosexual marriage, but they will bless it. They'll bless it they can bless it in a civil ceremony if kind of up to clergy. And it definitely seems like kind of a middle of the road thing that maybe probably won't make anyone happy, but I was just curious what your view on that was and your thoughts.
Yeah, that's great.
So it had to do with the Church of England and their stance on gay marriage is the question, and how C4SO is responding to that.
Yep. So we can't and bless nor officiate in a same-sex union, and that's a settled question within the wider Anglican Church in North America. The way Anglicanism works is not exactly the same way that Catholicism works, in the sense that in England, which is the kind of home base of Anglicanism, if Anglicanism worked like Catholicism, then the Archbishop of Canterbury would be like the Pope. He'd be hierarchically the boss. What England is a convening presence of provinces across the world. So they would consider in the Anglican Church that the English and the Archbishop of Canterbury are kind of a first among equals, to kind of go back to Roman phraseology, meaning choices made there don't dictate choices made elsewhere. So each province has had to create a sense in which they decided how they were going to engage, not just issues of same-sex union or same-sex behavior, but on a host of other things, probably best encompassed under how you read your Bible, how you understand the great tradition. And what the Anglican Church in North America has done is adopted a way of remembering that we are actually a part of a long story that has actually answered a lot of these questions around biblical authority, and then they've been re-asked and answered in different directions. So we see ourselves as really standing in continuity with the great tradition in the church. That being said, I think that at my church, Atlanta is a very gay place. Per capita, Midtown Atlanta is one of the gayest places in America, not just in our state, in America. And we have really fought hard to hold to a robust orthodoxy and yet be very, very courageous about how we reach out to and love people. I think Jesus was clear when he said it was the sick who needed a doctor. And so there's a sense in which we have people who know where we are, who are in a different place, who are saying, I want to grow and walk toward Jesus. And we say to them, like, come in, let's do this together. Let's walk it out. Now, there are going to be complexities to manage there, and there certainly are in my context. But the basic short answer to your question is there are people bouncing in different directions, but the Anglican Church with which he's a part of has answered this question, not in a new way, actually answered the question that keeps us in alignment with not just great tradition, but with the Roman Church and the Eastern Church. And I think that's actually a really important way to think of it. But thank you for that question. It is, as you said, a can of worms.
Yeah, I read as I was asking it, I was like, I wonder, and you answered the question too of how much you're tied to the Church of England,
yeah.
Anglican Church of England.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that I have a lot of friends in the Church of England, lived in England for a while. My daughter currently works at a Church of England church, and I consider those people who love Jesus to be my brothers and my sisters, and there are times and places where we don't all agree, and there are probably people who get so far apart that our faith is almost not even recognizable. That is absolutely true. But I know a lot of people in England who are they're wrestling with that in huge ways, because not every English Church of England or Anglican Church in England sees that the same way. There are people on both sides of that, and they're having a really hard time right now.
How does the Anglican Church see women in leadership?
How does the Anglican Church see women in leadership?
It's a great question.
That is a really good question. So I'll start. Yeah, I'll start with me and with our church and with our diocese, and then I'll go to our province, and then I'll go to the world. So if you think about Judea, Jerusalem, ends of the earth, I am, as a priest and pastor in God's church, joyfully and enthusiastically egalitarian. And egalitarian means full empowerment of women in ministry. Our church is joyfully, enthusiastically egalitarian, meaning that we celebrate women in ministry. We have women pastors, sent out women church planters. Our diocese is joyfully, enthusiastically egalitarian and has some churches in it that aren't so sure, that are more on what would be called the complementarian side. But we as a diocese are joyfully and enthusiastically egalitarian while making room for difference. Because, and I would go further, the province is a split reality. There are many who are not in support of women in ordination, and many like us in our diocese who are. And I think the reasons for that are not as simple as some on either side would want to make them out. Like sometimes I think that when you talk about these issues, people want to make them more hot button than maybe they could be or should be. And sometimes they are, just like people who are misogynistic, who think like women can't do X, Y, or Z because of A, B, or C. But I know a lot of people who are wrestling with those questions because they actually have some like historical, theological, sacramental questions around who's standing at the communion table in the place of Christ, serving the bride of Christ. And there's a sense of like conviction over there that would probably be foreign to a lot of us in terms of the like philosophical, ecclesiastical underpinnings, but they're legitimate. We, however, I think read those texts hermeneutically, and I'll get into, can I be like a little bit, just a little nerdy about this?
Absolutely.
Okay. A lot of people I know who don't stand over where the Roman Catholic Church would stand, and that's essentially what I just said. Like, there's the reason for male ordained fathers in the church is almost singularly sacramental. And it's a valid and important thing that you need to wrestle with before you just say, I don't like that. You just may not understand where they're coming from. On the side of the evangelical church, there are a lot of people who are reticent about ordaining women into ministry because they're afraid of the slippery slope. They think, well, you know, the Bible condones slavery. And so like women oppressed like slaves. I would say if you look at the Bible hermeneutically, and what hermeneutics mean is reading the text in light of the cultural arc and trajectory. Hermeneutics is really hard work, but it's really important work. William Webb wrote a book called Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals. I mean, if you want to sell some book titles, that is it. And what he, I believe, very compellingly argues is that while slavery was acknowledged in the pages of the Bible, right? We see it there. It was not the same as chattel slavery that we've experienced in North America. Anyone could find themselves in slavery. Anyone could buy themselves out of slavery. What you see in the New Testament is a liberating arc when it comes to slaves. They are called brothers, sisters in the Lord. They're coming to one table. There's a liberating arc. Webb also, I think, very compellingly argues that the liberating arc for women is also a radically, remarkably visible liberating arc. While First and Second Temple Judaism did not prize and empower and honor women, that is just a fact. Rabbi Hillel said that if a woman burns toast, you can divorce her. Jewish court of law at the time of Jesus said that women could not offer testimony in court. So if a woman witnessed a murder, nobody witnessed a murder. And yet Jesus had women in his close inner circle. That was scandalous, y'all. Do you know who preached the first sermon of the resurrection? Women. The two that went to the tomb and went back to the brothers and said, we've seen the Lord alive. And they didn't believe him. Jesus empowered women, I think, in a way that is remarkably contrary to the social context in which he lived. It was a liberating arc. You actually don't see the same thing with same-sex sexual relationships in Second Temple Judaism and in Roman city centers. There was actually a very permissive arc, and the church took a very conservative stance on those. So I believe that our egalitarianism is beautifully founded. I also know that not everybody sees it the same way. And within the wider Anglican Church, there are going to be people who see it differently. In our diocese, this is a settled question and something that I'm really happy about and really proud of. I hope that probably gives you way more than you asked for, but no, I love it. I gave you what I had. I like it.
What she was really trying to ask is, what do you do with Hannah and Leslie and Lexi?
I'm all in on these ladies. I think they are amazing. I know I don't need to tell you this, but y'all have an absurdity of gifting and talent on this staff, and those two women are remarkable, and you are lucky to have them. And I believe that the Lord is working there.
Paul had a question. Let's go to Paul.
So, two questions. One about C4.
Wait a minute, you only get one.
Two. You do too, Paul.
C4SO and then the 39 articles.
Yeah.
I don't really understand C4SO and its relationship to the bigger Anglican Church. When you said you were raised by hippies, I wondered, is that the hippie version of the Anglican Church? And then the 39 articles, how is that? I mean, there are things in there that the Apostles' Creed don't cover. And so how are those dealt with, say, when somebody is ordained in the Anglican Church?
Mm-hmm.
Could you just elaborate?
Great questions, Paul.
Can you tell Paul does his research?
I like it.
So the question has to do with C4SO and their relationship to the 39 Articles. And you said it's two. It's kind of one question.
No,
but it's a giant question.
That's two questions,
Okay.
and I like it. I'm here for it.
Go ahead.
So, how many counties are in the state of Montana? 6. Okay. 56. Okay, that's better. I was like, goodness, this is a big state for 6. I know, like, Atlanta has, I think we have 5 times the population of Montana in our city, but 56 is a better analogy. That helps me here. So if you think about province as state of Montana, diocese as 56 counties, that's probably the most helpful way to begin to think of it. C4SO is a diocese, but it is one of 2 non-geographic dioceses. So now let's put our Catholic brains on and let's think about orders within the Catholic Church. So the Jesuits are everywhere, and they've been tasked to do certain specific things that are translocal. So like there is probably a diocese here, and then the Jesuits would be interfacing sometimes in the cathedral. They would be going out and doing things maybe on res land, other places in the world, creating learning centers, building places like Gonzaga. So C4SO is sort of like an order meets a diocese in a bar and gets married. We have a specific task within the wider Anglican Church, which is to plant churches and engage in courageous and innovative advancing mission. So a lot of dioceses are not as interested in planting churches. They just want to be good Anglicans. We want to be good Anglicans and plant churches. And so we've been tasked by our wider province. So we've been tasked by Montana as Lewis and Clark County, which I still think is the coolest name for a county in the world. We only get 1 word in our counties. In Georgia, y'all have got 3. So if Lewis and Clark were C4SO, we've been tasked to do certain things that would benefit all of Montana. So does that help understand the question about the big and the little and how ours is a little bit unique? Or do you need more from me, Paul?
No, that's good.
Okay, that's great. And then the next one's the 39 Articles. So the 39 Articles, the official language around the 39 Articles, because of some of the stuff that is very culturally located around the moment of the Reformation. So you see some things that are very anti-papal or popist in the 39 Articles. Because of the heat that was happening during the time that the Articles were written, Anglicans, like us, have moved the 39 Articles to what's called historical documents, which means that we honor them, we recognize their significance and importance in Anglican history, but we recognize that not all 39 are equally applicable to the current situation that we're in. I would argue many of the 39 Articles are not only something we should think about, listen to, and engage, but they're also things that various traditions within the Great Tradition also think about, listen to, and engage. There are just a few, and enough, frankly, that are super culturally located that they've been moved to what we would call a historic document. And that's really important because the creeds have not been moved to historic document, but we recognize that like you can't read the 39 Articles and not think 1660s because it was actually, they were speaking to things that were super intense at the time in England, and they're just not quite as intense for you in Montana or me in Atlanta, or frankly, people in England now. There just is a little bit difference in the way you read all 39. I wouldn't say you don't pay any attention to them. I would just say pay attention to the ones, first 17 or 18 are pretty darn important. You get down toward the end and there's some that you'd think like, I don't know that I resonate with that. So they're historic documents for us.
Wow, that's good. Thank you. I've been wondering about some of those same questions.
You're welcome. I'm so glad to be helpful.
Okay, Jerry's on the mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think my question has been kind of part of a lot of other questions. Having grown up in a Catholic church, ultimately the final voice is the Pope. But have you said like that the Archbishop of Canterbury is kind of the top of the hierarchy in the Anglican Church, and maybe just like what is the hierarchy?
Yes. Can we just frame it as what's the hierarchy of the Anglican Church? Does that do justice to it?
So Anglicanism is not like the Catholic Church in that we call what we do in Anglicanism, we are a conciliar movement versus a strictly hierarchical movement. So the short answer, which I thought you were going to ask me a question about why I was slower than you when we were riding mountain bikes yesterday, and I'm really glad you didn't ask that question. The short answer is that the Archbishop is not the authority. He is a convener. And the way that convening happens within Anglicanism is every 10 years at Lambeth Palace in London, the leaders of the Anglican provinces all come together to pray, maybe argue, eat food, but there's not a sense of an edict coming down. And that is actually helps and hurts in some ways, because what you see in Anglicanism that you frankly don't see in some other traditions, for instance, like you mentioned, the Roman Church, is that there is more disparity and diversity of what people think and believe about certain things within Anglicanism, specifically because we're not hierarchical in the sense that everything goes back to either Rome or Canterbury. What is settled is that within each province, the Archbishop, and then within each diocese, so in our case, Bishop Todd Hunter in C4SO, they have, through the canons, which aren't easily changed, so canons are like governing, guiding documents, they've set the tone for where we are and where we fall on certain mainly theological issues. So what that means is that you're going to have like a province, our province is aligned in terms of what we believe about the big things about our faith. Basic, robust orthodoxy, small o orthodoxy. The big O orthodox is an actual church in the East. But you do have people in different parts of the world who might fall in different ways in terms of national churches, and it creates some tension sometimes. I think that it's actually really important to recognize that when you're discerning something, you never want to like discern something under the soft glow of the moonlight. You know, if I were going to buy a car, I want to look at it in the daytime, not at night, because you miss some things at night. So I'll be the first to tell you that Anglicanism is as messy as almost all the like various churches and traditions in the world. I would be lacking intellectual integrity if I didn't acknowledge that it can be a messy family. And yet, I don't know if I can quote that Augustine quote here because we've got.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. St. Augustine said the church is a whore and she is our mother. And I love that, because what that does for me is it reminds me that we're a part of a messy thing and yet we're family. The gift of where we are in C4SO and the wider Anglican Church is that we're in a really settled place. It's not up for grabs. It's not something that gets to change easily or really at all. And a lot of that is our guiding documents have really locked us in on what I think is a really beautiful form of Orthodox expression of faith. Does that answer the question for you?
All right, super softball question. Given that we have elections this year in Montana, and one of the things that we're voting on is on abortion, what is the Anglican Church's view on abortion?
Whoa.
Wow. She just like, I hate to know what a hard pitch looks like. The Anglican Church's view of abortion. We could convene. We could just say we're out of time.
Dang, I've got somewhere to go. I don't know. Thank you for that question. The Anglican Church in America is a decidedly pro-life movement. I believe that there are, and emerging within our diocese, personally believe that pro-life means a lot more than just what happens in a delivery room. I think that political platforms that do not protect and defend mothers and children pre and post are lacking in really and truly a robust understanding of what it means to be pro-life. So that is more probably commentary on the fact that our political system is probably not wired or interested to have more holistic and integrated conversations. But I believe that if anyone in the universe should be having integrated and holistic conversations, it's the Church of Jesus. And so when I at my church say we are pro-life, what I mean is that we are going to put our money where our mouth is on helping at-risk moms, including walking with at-risk moms who make decisions that are really painful and hard decisions to make and carry a lot of pain and need to be welcomed in as members of the family of God and loved on. So we are pro-life. And I think that pro-life in the church should mean a whole heck of a lot more than it means on ballot boxes. I think there's a lot more going on there. And I probably could say more, but I'm going to stop because I don't want to get in trouble or make his life harder. Okay, good.
When's the last time someone got applause on anything said about abortion?
No.
So I just have a quick follow-up really on Rebecca's question, but if you are an Anglican Christian in America contemplating issues like abortion or same-sex marriage, you bought the church, like authority of the Anglican Church, why should that person listen to the ACNA versus the Episcopal Church, which would answer it differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, so the question has to do with the ACNA's authority versus the Episcopal Church's authority, and you might have to do some educating before you answer that question.
Yeah. Remember I was saying, I think when you asked the question, every nation has a province. And the historic and official province of the Anglican Church in the United States is the Episcopal Church. The Anglican Church in North America emerged as a response to what is, I believe, undoubtedly a deeply heterodox. You may want to explain some of these terms, but what I believe is like the Episcopal Church is not just at times progressive, but is activistically so in a way that is actually not even analogous to what's happening in the Church of England. Like my friend over there, my friends in the Church of England don't agree on certain things, and yet we'll still go have a beer with one another and say we're family and we don't agree. And that's probably just because they never flew a flag that said, don't tread on me. You know, we've got independence. It's like hardwired into our bones. So the Anglican Church in North America is a conservative expression of Anglicanism, which is in a way almost like a rival province. I mean, there's just no getting around it. So as someone who is going to look to guidance, you have to ultimately decide what kind of guidance you're willing and interested to listen to. And I don't mean this to be ugly in any way, because I have friends in the Episcopal Church, but I believe that generally speaking, the Episcopal Church in Atlanta, in terms of our cathedral, has less and less credible and meaningful stuff to say to someone who is looking to uphold a biblical historical orthodoxy. Now, that doesn't mean that people sometimes in the ACNA, Anglican Church in North America, aren't moving further to the right in their tone in the way they speak to things, which is why I love being in the diocese that we're in. Within Anglicanism, your diocese actually constitutes about 95% of your lived reality. And our Bishop Todd, I would commend, if he hasn't been able to make them available, Todd's Substack. I mean, he's written on everything from Christian nationalism to abortion to how should we think about things politically to how are we going to navigate things like the pandemic. And having a gracious Orthodox leader gives us a sense of a wealth of resources to not just tell us how to think, but help us to know how to think. Because the way Anglicanism works is our bishop's not going to tell us what to think, but he's going to give us resources, and we have some really good ones. But for me, the Episcopal Anglican thing is super complicated, super painful, and actually in some ways I think the Episcopal Church is so different in the way that it thinks theologically from the Anglican Church that really and truly you're probably not going to be terribly confused if you're looking for insight if you have a leaning one way or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it's complicated. We could go on for it. You and I are going to have to get more beer. We're not going to ride bikes together, but we'll have to sit and talk about it.
The way you ride bikes with him is you ask a question at the bottom of Mount Ascension, and then while you're in pain, by the time you get to the top, he's done answering the question, and you've got really good understanding, and you forgot you were climbing. It's the perfect way to do it.
Most people only talk about one side of pro-life, and I'm wondering about the death penalty, how that church, how the Anglican Church feels about the death penalty.
Wow. Okay.
How does the Anglican Church feel about the death penalty?
I don't know. I don't think that that our diocese, to my awareness, has ever published or made like an intentional or a specific kind of white paper stance on the death penalty. So I don't think I can answer that question with any kind of credibility. I do know that St. Paul says that the government does not wield the sword in vain, as he's speaking about descriptive realities in the ancient Roman world. But in terms of like a big stance on the death penalty, I'm not aware of what that stance would be. I have no idea.
You can disagree with me here, but I keep coming back to a conversation you and I had, and I won't get into the specifics, but what comes to mind in a lot of these questions is that the litmus test of one's Christianity in Anglicanism is the creeds, right? So on lots of these things, there's room to disagree. and yet we're not going to deny, we're not going to make the litmus test of whether or not someone's a Christian anything other than the confession of the creeds. Is that
That is
accurate?
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's room for unity and essentials and diversity and other things. And people, really smart people, come to different conclusions on lots of important issues. And I would think that capital punishment would be one of them. I know very few people who would joyfully pull the switch, and yet there are people who believe in capital punishment and some that don't, who've come to those decisions in a very reasoned way. And I don't think we have to probably see all that exactly the same way. So yes.
And it comes back to the fact that Anglicanism isn't seeking to be exclusive. Like, I'm thinking of Michael in Waco, who you know better than I do, who was explaining to me that his membership class, there's 2 tracks. And there's a track where if you want to be catechized Anglican, you can become a member of his church. And if you just want to be a member of his church, but you're not being catechized Anglican, that's also okay. And I think especially for those of us in Montana who we know like non-denominationalism or Roman Catholicism, and those are the only things we know. In my conversations, one of the things that keeps coming up is it's hard for us to get our heads around, you don't have to become Anglican to be counted as Christian or communed within an Anglican church. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Okay. To me, those are really helpful things because it speaks to how it shows up a little bit differently. It's fun. I would have never thought this all becomes political.
So I always like to ask kind of this open-ended question of, is there anything you hold, like any views you hold that you feel are fairly controversial among, or different from your peers, or something that you're passionate about that you feel like most Christians view a different way? It's kind of just something I always enjoy sometimes. I know a lot of people, you always don't have the platform to pop it out of the box. So if you have like this thing that's oh yeah, I always like to, whenever it comes up.
What are your theological blue parakeets?
I feel like I'm somewhat boring on these things. I don't think that I hold something that would be controversial or provocative. I mean, sadly, I think that sometimes reaching lost people sometimes sadly feels provocative to Christians, which should not be the case. And so at our church, we gather twice a year and we gather people who are not Christians, and we feed them and we give them beer and we talk about Jesus, and we see a lot of them become Christians. And I guess in some circles, gathering people who are not Christians, talking about Jesus and giving them beer might be controversial, but I don't understand why it would be. So no, I don't think I hold really any non-orthodox or questionable views about things.
Can you walk us through? This is one of my questions that I guess I could ask tonight, but I'm going to ask it now, because one of the things that's foreign in my world is pastor priest. So why do Anglicans, why do they call their clergy priests? Can you walk us through that? But yet I don't hear you being referred to that in your church.
Yeah.
Functionally.
Yeah. So I'm not referred, but I am one. It just comes from essentially an English rendering of a Greek word, presbyter, which is derived from Hebrew language that would imply priest. So that's what it is. And yet priests, obviously within the Anglican tradition, marry, and we're not celibate and single. And but we have a lot of freedom to call ourselves what we want to call ourselves. I call myself Kris, and people in my church call me Kris. And I guess my official title would be Canon Reverend Dr. Kris McDaniel, but I'm just Kris, because we're the kind of church that believes that we're all in this thing together, and that people are people, and that it's better for me to be a person and not a title. But I don't look down on people who would call themselves something else, but we have a lot of freedom to call ourselves what we want to call ourselves.
Helpful. Bo.
I'm just, since you're here kind of on behalf of Anglicanism, how is it received in a more urban context? And what's the benefit? I mean, what are you seeing in Atlanta as reception to a more historical faith?
Oh, that's really good.
How is Anglicanism received in a more urban context?
So just to be candid with you, when I said earlier on that we had started picking up Anglican treasures, one of our reasons for doing that was that early on our church was growing really fast. And I will admit to you that I thought, well, if we read more of the Bible, it'll probably slow down church growth. So in some ways, Anglicanism for us has not been quote unquote helpful in a church growth sense, we actually adopted it as a kind of church growth retardation strategy. We wanted to slow it down by becoming more and more immersed in and a people of the book. So the benefit is that our church, because we read, I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think that Anglicanism is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, volume of Bible reading in its liturgy worshiping communities in the world. At my church, we read 5 different passages of scripture every Sunday. So the benefit for us has been to be Anglican meant that we are joining in with a tradition that is immersing our people in the Bible. Anglicans, since the very beginning, referred to themselves as people of the book, and that really always appealed to me. So we have found that people have an appetite to be immersed in Scripture. Like I said earlier, do y'all have Denny's here? Buffets? You surely have those, right? They're terrible places. We wanted to treat the Bible because I believed that I was like a full Bible person, but would conveniently not read lots of the Bible. And I was like, what is that? So Anglicanism for me and our church really exposed us to more and more of the scripture, which actually grew our church up in terms of like immersion, biblical literacy, being aware of what the texts are. The other benefit that is more of an intangible benefit that you frankly already get is that Anglicanism for me placed me under authority, which made me a better person, a better leader, a safer leader. And that's already happening, whether you become Anglican or not as a church, because he is one. And so that's a benefit that people don't even always know how to ask for. But what I do believe in an urban city center is that people are highly suspicious. And I think that's true everywhere now. We're increasingly tribalistic. We're increasingly cranky, post-Christian. So whether it's a rural or an urban place, people are pretty suspicious of religion. And so when pastors are yoked and tethered to spiritual authority, I think people feel that whether you talk about it or not. I'm under authority and I have a really strong personality, and it's good for me to be under authority because it actually liberates me to be who God's called me to be. And those are some of the greatest gifts that I've received and our church has received when it comes to Anglicanism. And also, we just haven't had to reinvent the wheel.
What's the reception?
So we took, by the time I started journeying down this road to the time our church came in was about a 2-year process. And by the time we got there, our church was like, okay, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck. So it was a very warmly received thing. That being said, our church isn't a kind of Anglican banner waving, like we're not pumped up about being Anglicans all the time. People come to Trinity because it's Trinity, and we're joyfully Anglican, but we don't get up and talk about Anglicanism any more than, I get up and talk about, my grandparents all the time. Like they're dead and gone, love them, wouldn't be who I am without them, but that's not what animates why most of the people in our church come to our church. But I think they benefit from us being immersed in something deeper, bigger, older, not having to reinvent the wheel all the time. A lot of the things that I think people care about. Here's one thing that I know about you. People who go to churches don't wake up every morning thinking about the minutia and the inner workings of the church. A lot of people are just trying to get through the week and love their families and do their jobs. And so if a church positions itself to be secure and stable and cared for and anchored, people actually, the best denominational system is one that you're not having to think about or talk about all the time. In the sense that when I'm watching a football game, I know the rest did their job when they're not front and center the whole time because they've actually kept the game moving. And I think that leadership should be that way as well.
That's good. That's very helpful. And I think there's a question way back there, Hannah. I think it speaks to, I think part of the cultural moment we're in as a church is, what does it look like for us to steward what God has done here? And we've always kind of flippantly said it may or may not last very long. It may or may not last forever. And I think to me, part of what's emerging here is to what extent is it our responsibility to create something that outlives me, outlives our existing council, outlives our existing staff.
Yeah.
What is it that we're trying to do for our community?
Let me say something about that before the question. So when my wife and I lived in England in the late 90s, we had our first child in England, and we were part of a little non-denominational charismatic church. So we were not in an Anglican church there. But our friends went home. They left. They left our church and went back to their village church, which was a Church of England church. And it was in a village called Pencilwood which is maybe the coolest name for a village ever. It's this tiny little town that had a medieval church that was probably a quarter of the size of this room, and it was a 600-year-old building. And I was a hippie, non-denominational, chacos wearing, long-haired kid from America, and I stood in the back of this church and I watched them ring the bells and get up with 15 people, and I started to cry. And I had no sense of Anglicanism at the time, other than I remember standing at the back and saying, these people have been doing this for a really long time. This is older than the Declaration of Independence. This is bigger than a personality. And then I remember N.T. Wright saying in Durham, when he was the Bishop of Durham, we haven't done a lot well, but one thing we have done is we've prayed in this building every day for 900 years. Through the Black Death, through the Blitz, we've gathered for 900 years to pray. And he was like, we haven't always been impressive. Sometimes there were 6 of us. Sometimes there were revivals. And for me, those things, the bell ringing in the church and N.T. Wright's wisdom, helped me realize, like, man, we Christians have been doing this for a really long time. And that makes my own planning meetings not unimportant around what we're doing on a Sunday, but it locates it within something that doesn't always have to be sexy. It can just be old and deep, just like a river is old and deep. And that was for me a really compelling piece, because I was just like, gosh, this takes a lot of pressure off of me without absolving me of the responsibility to be me. Just puts me in a bigger story.
Okay, so you get the last word. I don't have my contacts in today because I wasn't planning on riding my bike, so I can't even see your face. Oh, Scott gets the last word, but the word has got to be hearable. You got to talk loud enough that we can hear you.
Just so you know. What's your top book choice right now?
Whoa.
What's your top book choice? That was a nice question to end on.
Whoa. So any genre at all? Wow. Okay, I'm going to answer that in 3 ways. Because I'm a pastor and I'm holding the microphone. My favorite work of fiction is a tie between Brothers Karamazov and East of Eden, with a nod toward East of Eden. I think East of Eden is going to be in heaven. I think Brothers Karamazov is going to be in heaven. I think the book of Revelation tells us that the goods of the kingdoms of the earth will be ushered into the New Jerusalem. Those 2 works will be in heaven. Les Mis will also be in heaven. My favorite theological book would be Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright, which is the Cliff's Notes version, or if you're young these days, the Spark Notes version of the Resurrection of the Son of God, which I think the Resurrection of the Son of God is maybe one of the most important Christian books that has ever been written, but I would not ask you to read it because it's 790 pages. And N.T. Wright's own father said to him, son, it really picked up after page 560. So just read Surprised by Hope, because it's got the guts of it. It's really good. And my favorite leadership type book, which I'm not prone to leadership books, but my favorite one is Ed Friedman's book, A Failure of Nerve. That book changed my life when I was in grad school, because it's about differentiated leadership, about cultivating a non-anxious presence, which I think we need non-anxious leadership both in the church and in the business world right now, because the world's crazy out there. So 3 books.
Damn.
A good note to end on.
Thank you so much for all of the time and energy you put into this. Now we get to have a beer.
Super fun, y'all. God bless you guys. Thank you.
Let's end this. Will you pray for us before we take off? It'd just be fun to have you pray for us. And then let's do that.
Father, I thank you so much for this assembled group of people. God, I ask you to bless them. I pray that you would fill their tanks and energize them. God, thank you for the gift of hospitality that this church possesses. And I pray, Lord, that you would lead, guide, and protect Narrate as she steps into the future. God, we thank you for the fact that there was only one thing that you said the gates of hell would not prevail against, and it's the church. And I thank you that you would bless and keep and protect this church. God, I thank you for the staff team. Thank you for the council. Thank you, God, for all the people here who would care enough to spend an afternoon talking about things that matter, Lord. Would you bless this group of people and this city in Jesus' name? Amen.
Thank you guys for coming out.
If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.